and we identify where the interferences are in your body and where the deficiencies may be. And so it's different than when you get your annual physical with your doctor and they do a cursory, overview and, oh, your cholesterol's high, here's a statin, or looks like you may be trending towards some prediabetes or diabetes, here's some metformin. What we're really looking at in the blood labs are the causative agents that are developed, and then patterns that are developed because of those causative agents. And so we'll look at your labs in much more detail and we'll narrow the ranges so that we can determine maybe your hormonal imbalances, for example, are from a digestive issue. There's a pathway in your gut called beta-glucuronidase. So maybe you're not conjugating and unconjugating hormones properly. Or we'll look at other markers and we'll say, well, here's why your cholesterol levels are high. Here's why your LDL cholesterol is high, because you've got these markers that show oxidative stress because your ferritin's high and your C-reactive protein. And then we structure peptides based on those lab values to actually help stabilize those lab values so that we're actually getting to the root cause.
Hi, this is Alan Olson, and welcome to American Dreams. My guest today is Regan Archibald. Regan, welcome to today's show.
So good to be here, Alan.
So, in your life path, can you give the listeners your timeline of how you got to where you are today? Let's start from college and your aspirations of career path.
Well, the biggest thing that got me into medicine and healthcare is I grew up on a farm, cattle ranch in Idaho, and I wanted to be anything but a farmer when I grew up. And my uncle was a doctor, so I said, he's got weekends off, he seems happy. I would love to be able to help people on a different level instead of herding cattle and moving sprinkler pipe. And so that was my first inspiration. And what happened to me is I was misdiagnosed by 5 different doctors when I was studying my pre-medicine work at the University of Utah. And I realized I wanted to study a different type of medicine when it was a naturopathic physician and acupuncturist who helped me recover my health. They actually ran the right labs and said, wow, you've got Hashimoto's, Regan. And so we ended up working on my diet, my nutrition. This was 25 years ago, before gluten-free was a thing. And I was a gluten-free person, and completely recovered my energy. I went from, feeling lethargic and falling asleep in class. And I've always been good at school, so that was unusual for me, to having my motivation back, getting my fitness back, and ended up going to school in Hawaii and studying at an integrated medical school there that Earl Bakken founded. And then I was there for 4 years, came back to Utah and founded EastWest Health 20 years ago.
Well, that's amazing. It's an amazing path and, a journey that sounds like there are a couple turns in the road and getting you to the EastWest. Is it EastWest Medical?
EastWest Health, yes.
EastWest Health. Let's talk about EastWest Health and, you're dealing with peptides.
Yeah.
Is that right? Tell us what is it for listeners? What is a peptide?
Well,
Just take it basic. So
I love this question because we learn so much about hormones and we think, oh, that's really, you want to optimize your hormones, which I'm a big fan of, and we do that clinically. But if you think about the short messages that go on in our bodies, these come from protein structures called peptides. So peptides are 50 amino acid chains or fewer, and there's over 7,000 peptides that exist. To date, we've sequenced about 10% of those, so maybe about 700, and they all have a biological impact. And so you can use peptides to influence your brain health, peptides influence your cardiovascular health, peptides influence any genetic pathway in your body. What a peptide is kind of like a text message. So you and I can text each other back and forth and we send each other small messages, but those messages are communication lines that allow for action to take place. So, hey, Alan, I'd love to be on the American Dream podcast, and I want you on my Unreasonable Health podcast. And so, those text messages are great. And then we send an email, and an email is more like a hormone, which is a longer kind of communication pathway. So let me send you my bio. I'll send it through email. So peptides are the way that our bodies turn on different genetic frequencies and different genetic functions and turn off different disease patterns.
So when we're dealing with peptide therapy, what exactly is peptide therapy?
So peptide therapy would be where I run people's labs. So we order comprehensive blood panels, and then we identify where the interferences are in your body and where the deficiencies may be. And so it's different than when you get your annual physical with your doctor and they do a cursory, overview and, well, your cholesterol's high, here's a statin, or looks like you may be trending towards some prediabetes or diabetes, here's some metformin. What we're really looking at in the blood labs are the causative agents that are developed and then the patterns that are developed because of those causative agents. And so we'll look at your labs in much more detail and we'll narrow the ranges so that we can determine maybe your hormonal imbalances, for example, are from a digestive issue. There's a pathway in your gut called beta glucuronidase. And so maybe you're not conjugating and unconjugating hormones properly. Or we'll look at other markers and we'll say, well, here's why your cholesterol levels are high. Here's why your LDL cholesterol is high, because you've got these markers that show oxidative stress because your ferritin's high and your C-reactive protein. And then we structure peptides based on those lab values to actually help stabilize those lab values so that we're actually getting to the root cause. And so we may give you a peptide like tesamorelin, and that peptide is very well known. It went through all phase 3 of the clinical trials of the FDA in 2012 to treat lipodystrophy. So it actually helps shrink organ fat in the body, and it's also really good for putting on muscle. So, but tesamorelin also helps mitigate oxidative stress in the body because it stimulates the growth hormone pathway in your pituitary. So it's a way that we can turn back the clock, but remember, it's a text message, so it's not going to influence cancerous growth in the future. And that's the real benefit of peptides is they have low accumulation, low toxicity. And so peptide therapy essentially is finding out how we can optimize your health with the smallest amount of input possible, but the largest amount of output. So we don't want to override your biological systems. We don't want to suppress symptoms per se. All we want to do is just turn on those right genetic expressions so that your body can now heal itself and your body can start to reverse its aging process.
So aging is one solution that you're providing in there through anti-aging through the peptide process. And I want to go down that path a little bit more, delve into it, but I want to ask another question. So a person says, hey, Regan, I'm having trouble sleeping. Yeah. Can a peptide solve that?
Oh, beautiful. Yeah. So then we'd go, and I don't mean to be nuanced on this, but I'd say, okay, well, why aren't you sleeping? And let's get some blood labs ran. But in general, there's some very powerful peptides that have been heavily studied. One of my favorite peptides is called epitalin. And this particular peptide has been researched since the 1970s. And what it does is it resets the circadian rhythm by working on the pituitary gland. So the pituitary and the pineal gland, what they do is they influence all the hormones in the body. And so the pituitary gland specifically has an axis called your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And if you're waking up frequently at night, or if you can't fall asleep, we use epitalin to reset that stress response in your body so that your body can now fall into a deeper sleep. It's also a telomerase enzyme, so it lengthens the telomeres on the end of your DNA. And if you've heard like David Sinclair talk about this or Aubrey de Grey, what epitalin will do, what the research shows is it stimulates from the pineal gland these beautiful enzymes that basically pull the DNA tight. They create DNA silencing, and that DNA silencing allows your telomere expansion to extend, and it turns off diseases. So in the studies, you'll find that not only do people have a reset of their circadian rhythms. I just spoke to a patient of mine yesterday, and this particular client, he said, I've never slept better in 20 years since, and he's on day 5 on epitalin. and just getting started on it. And he said, I mean, he was in a massive situation of stress for 6 years, going through divorce. He took his business from 1 million to 40 plus million. And he's like just like a supercharged human. But he came to that place where he hit a wall and he couldn't sleep because he's pushing himself too long. And so epitalin is what's turned things around for him. So yeah, so epitalin's one of those peptides, and there's a few others, but that's the primary one.
How are peptides administered? Are they put directly into the bloodstream, or are they taken through pills and digested?
Great question, Alan. So peptides primarily are injections. So they're subcutaneous injections. You use an insulin syringe, and if anyone's seen those, they're tiny little syringes. It's nothing more than a little pinch. It's pretty simple to do. But because of the nature of these molecules, they're very fragile, and so you don't want them to be ingested in a lot of cases because the hydrochloric acid in your stomach is going to break down these molecules before they get to where they need to go. So, like epitalin is a sub-Q injection. But there's other peptides like BPC 157, KPV, and these are peptides that are naturally made in your gastric secretions. So they're made in your stomach, your small intestine, even the colon somewhat with KPV. And those can be consumed orally. You can inject them. You can use them as a nasal spray, even as a mouth spray.
It says, so I'm not a doctor. I don't have the background in the medical profession, but what caused me to ask the question is I have a friend who's a pathologist, and I mentioned him, I'm taking these anti-aging pills. Because pills? He goes, well, because if you want something to really work, you ingest it directly to the bloodstream. So thank you for the clarification, and also this is now going directly into the bloodstream
Yeah.
will raise questions about medicine. So person says, Regan, I want to come to you at EastWest Health and work with you, but you have one location. Do you work with other doctors, or how does a person come to you to work?
Yeah. And so, Alan, we have probably 80% of our client base is outside of Utah. And so it depends on the state that you're in, but with the compounding pharmacies that we use, we don't do any kind of peptides that are outside of the what is allowed by the FDA from very skilled compounding pharmacies. There's only two compounding pharmacies in the United States that make the peptides that we need, and I vet these pharmacies regularly, and so the best way is for people to reach out. You can either email me directly at Regan, Regan, at acueastwest.com, or you can simply text our phone number 801-582-2011, and that will give people direct access to us, and we can work with you no matter what state you're in. We work with a lot of Canadians, and then we also have patients who live in France. We have patients in Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. And so we can still do quite a bit of coaching, and then we work with local pharmacies in the area to try to get the peptides that our patients need in those regions.
How are peptides affecting longevity right now?
There's a lot of different studies on bioregulators, and so probably the most prominent researcher on peptides is Dr. Kovinson, and he's out of Russia. And so a lot of people say, oh no, it's research out of Russia, it can't be real. But actually, there's not incentives for researchers in Russia like there is in the United States. So in some ways, his research is very pure, and he's been studying peptides, bioregulators specifically since 1974. And what he's discovered is that by using specific bioregulators for different organs and tissues, he's seen a life expectancy change of about 7 to 10 years, or over 30% in some of the groups that he's worked with. And he has some of the largest cohorts of people in his longevity studies. Some of his studies span over the course of 35 years. with over 30,000 people, specifically with using a bioregulator called Panilion, and that works on the pineal gland. He found that by using that bioregulator with a bioregulator called Vessel and another bioregulator for the brain, he found that these people not only lived longer versus the group that didn't take the bioregulators, but they lived longer by about 30%. And they didn't have a lot of the chronic diseases. So in the United States, we have this kind of problem at the last 10 years of people's lives is they have comorbidities, and so they're halfway dead before they fully die. In Eastern medicine, our philosophy is we want people to live with unreasonable health for a very long time, but then to have compressed morbidity. So when it's time to die, we die fast. And that's where I see the most research as far as the longest term research is on these bioregulators. But if you look at some of the newer research, David Sinclair's talking a lot about a peptide called MOD-SC. And MOD-SC is a natural expression in our bodies. It's more phenotypically expressed in the Japanese population. But MOD-SC has been shown as an exercise mimetic, and it turns on longevity genes. And in fact, do you like to sauna, Alan?
Do I like it?
Yeah. Or do you jump in a sauna ever? Okay.
Sometimes. So I'm kind of like sometimes to do, and but I'm not I don't do it frequently. I'll say that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there may be some benefits, especially if you like the sweat. But when we jump into a sauna, we get this production of what are called heat shock proteins, and those heat shock proteins trigger MOD-SC. So remember, the peptides that we use are natural expressions in the body, and so MOD-SC is one of these natural expressions. So jumping into a sauna using MOD-SC can be some great ways to influence longevity.
So Regan, there's a lot of venues of the utilization of peptides. How does a person get started with you? In other words, what is the process?
And if somebody is, so there's kind of three criteria that I look at. I want to work with people who have a future bigger than their past. Our mutual mentor, Dan Sullivan, he's ingrained that into your brain and mine. And so people need to have really ambitious goals in their health. And so if that's you, it's also somebody who has already done some foundational work on their health. If things are completely broken and, you're just looking for kind of a Hail Mary, I don't know that we're the right clinic. In the past, I took on a lot of clients like that. We're just too busy. So I want to take on people who are looking for that edge, that 10%, that 5%, even 3% edge in their health. And then finally, it's people who are willing to do the right testing, because, my job is to make sure that your next decade is your best decade, and to make sure there's no death by neglect. And so the way that people can work best with us is, first of all, get your functional blood chemistry ran. So we run very comprehensive panels when you text the office or email us. If you have blood labs ran, you can send those in, and then you and I can sit down and talk about what your goals are, what you'd like to accomplish in your health in the next 10 years, what you'd like to accomplish in the next 90 days, because a lot of people, they want to lose, 10 to 30 pounds. And that's, we have an average weight loss in our protocols of about 30 pounds in 7 months. But it depends on what your goals are. But then once we have the right labs, then I'll put together a very specific peptide protocol for you. We have an incredible team here. We have fitness advisors, we have health coaches. Accountability is a big part of it. But then we do some of the more advanced testing like Gallery, where we can screen for cancer, 4 years before it becomes problematic or before it will show up in any other tests. We can look at different coronary scores. We do DEXA scans. So there's very nuanced tests that we'll look at to get you to the next level.
So reaching out to you, they do it off the website or phone call, or what is the best way?
You could go to thepeptideexpert.com, and I've got a free download for all the listeners. the American Dream podcast today. And so go to the Peptide Expert. You'll see your free download. The other thing that you can do is you could text the office at 801-582-2011, or you can email me directly, and I do answer these and ask you any questions on peptides or any various health concerns that you may have. And it's Regan, Regan, at acueastwest.com.
Well, Regan, it's been a pleasure having you with us on today's show.
Thanks so much for having me, Alan.